City people are different. It's no secret that a significant portion of the ideological divide in Western civilization is caused by the conflict between rural and urban mentalities. And this is quite evident on the map of American elections. Interestingly, from this perspective, humanity behaves like a mycelium. And like mycelium, its structure has two main elements: nodes and paths. Nodes, in this case, are densely populated, urbanized areas that serve as the smaller organs of larger societal organism. They are intersections. They are places of accumulation of material, which is subsequently used for production. On the other hand, paths serve to connect individual nodes with each other, facilitating the exchange of materials and the resulting ability for economic symbiosis among different organs. Paths play the role of veins pumping nutrients and blood. Both of these societal functions require completely different mental settings, as their purpose and goals differ. And the organs, the cities, seem to be currently very much immersed in effort to eliminate a large portion of the essence of humanity itself. We are watching how the city mentality is, in many ways, smothering our spirit. Look, cities are not going anywhere. And I am most certainly not suggesting that everyone should leave them. It is also not my point to paint city people as an enemy of humanity. I also come from a somewhat urban environment. But this whole situation of human adaptation to this environment deserves thorough scrutiny. Well, in the following discussion we will focus on the question of what the hell happened. Welcome to Magna Mirare. Humanity is a peculiar species in that we are not born into the natural world. A giraffe, for example, can have a lunch while giving a birth and then essentially just nudges its newly born calf into the African safari, where it happily roams as an ancient part of the ecosystem within 5 minutes. We, humans, have, however, constructed our own world around us. We have cleared forests, burned stumps and roots, and extracted rocks from the Earth's soil. And then we built as many walls as possible between us and what remained of the forest. And that's not a bad idea. Wolves and bears get hungry. And who knows what else may roam around the dark wilderness. So it is simply in our nature, with all the good, bad and ugly implications it has. But this also means that we are both individually and as a society responsible for the type of world we surround ourselves with when replacing nature. In many ways, a city is constrained by the necessity to enable perfect permeability. It all revolves around the transportation system. Well, in the human body, you are always only a few micrometers away from the nearest blood vessel. And same goes for transportation in city. Amidst mass transit, personal transportation and supply vehicles, people spend an incredible amount of time transporting themselves, other people, or materials and objects from point A to point B. Modern cities, especially in America, have taken their focus on vehicles to such an absurdity that one is constantly surrounded by the awareness that cars are basically the primary inhabitants of the city. The whole spectacle is done for them. And you as an individual are small, insignificant cog performing a small, insignificant task at point A, point B, or you are engaging in the transportation of things between these 2 points. The second element shaping the city, making it what it is essentially, is the ultimate focus on population density. Everything in the city must be adapted to accommodate a large number of inhabitants at once. Historically, the basic state of humanity rested on each person having their dwelling, their little kingdom belonging to their family and kin. These were of course communal, but the community was a very personal matter. And part of this kingdom was not just the space inside, but also the space outside. The space under the sky that belonged to them as strongly as their own bed, With that space came a de facto piece of blue sky and stars above their heads. This is a very intimate connection between your own small world and the natural transcendent immensity that surrounds you. In a modern city, however, it's not like that. One is glad to have a small box, surrounded on all sides by different yet identical boxes, in which different yet identical people live. You don't own any piece of the sky, or any piece of genuinely open space. You are constantly under the pressure of communal sharing. Every existential need is organized solely for the purpose of being as identical as possible in its execution, to be applicable to a million other people. From the very nature of the scale in which an individual is considered in this context, one never can mean anything in comparison. For Christ's sake, even the life cycle of your own waste in the shared sewer system is more scrutinized than you will ever be as an individual. Suddenly, this is the immensity that surrounds you. It is not the ineffable transcendence of the universe, because you can't even see stars, but the immensity of the effort that is put into keeping you in a human beehive. From this practical necessity springs one of the worst drawbacks of modernity regarding urbanism. I personally find modern architecture simply appalling, but this problem goes beyond personal taste. At the root lies functionalism, steel, glass put together into cube shapes. Especially Americans are significantly unlucky due to the absence of any historicity of their nation, as they don't even have remnants of medieval historic city centers, which, although also urban in nature, were crafted by our ancestors, who at least didn't lose the sense that one should surround oneself with beauty and organic authenticity. In a modern city, one doesn't encounter organic elements apart from carefully choreographed greenery. One lives surrounded by cubes. The world is cubes, the landscape is cubes, dwelling are cubes, man is a cube, everyone is cubes. Perfect, symmetrical, uncomplicated, and inauthentic cubes. A clear example of this is the planned city of Brasilia. Designed during the 1950s, the city is a monument to optimization with numbered blocks and clearly defined sectors, such as the hotel sector or banking sector. This top-down, hyper-optimized approach is excellent for a Factorio playthrough, but absolutely terrible regarding human happiness and fulfillment. What I'm getting at is that regardless of personal taste, functionalism is simply a hyper-rationalistic decision to let the engineers and mathematicians handle it. And I see why, of course. There is a clear merit to it. We are talking about scales that simply need a carefully orchestrated approach. But this approach is also one-sided. It feeds only one of our hemispheres, so to say. And this one-sidedness is instinctively source of cognitive disbalance. At some level, I believe, we all instinctively feel subsequent disharmony. And there is an effort to mitigate it, and it's incredibly hit or miss. Often, the modern urbanistic architect feels this itch to create something worthwhile. But sadly, rarely the true intention behind it is beauty. I think that prevailing effort is to create something original and interesting, which eventually feels incredibly egocentric. A building built by someone who doesn't even live in the place where it now stands. For him, it's about awards and prizes, but not about the eventual reality of living with such a heritage. The question of taste is, of course, due to its subjective nature, immensely complicated. And the Eiffel Tower in Paris was first hated, before it was accepted as a part of the Parisian landscape. But for every happy ending, there is a myriad of conceptual abstract monstrosities, with somewhat sick motivation behind it. The absence of humility and commitment that should be felt towards the inhabitants that will be forced to live with this creation for generations. Well, Gothic Cathedral is no way less intrusive than any modern monstrosity. It's a huge building, it's ever present, it changes the landscape. But its philosophical and spiritual statement is much more humble than anything we, as a secular hypermaterialistic civilization, are capable of handling. Look, I am not an enemy of cities. I am also not necessarily an enemy of functionalism itself. I actually really do love playing city skylines. In a sense, city is a monument to human optimizational capabilities. But through that, it is also a very limited environment. And how are then the modern liberal people shaped by such an environment? They are anonymous and insignificant. Their work only makes sense due to the volume in which it is performed by masses of other insignificant people. Each one of them is replaceable. They lack security of real community. Social cohesion is fragile, no matter how hard we try to maintain the impression of civilization. The fact remains that a person is, in any case, in constant instinctive and fundamentally biological stress, as they are constantly surrounded by a crowd of people they absolutely do not know. The only way to cope with this, in long term, is to tune down our basic instincts, not even acknowledging the alertness that evolution built within us over millions of years to keep us alive. Personal involvement in an authentic community is replaced by a sense of normalcy. I don't know the people passing me on the street, but we all intensely push to become an unsurprising herd. If we are not surprising, if we are average and ordinary, and if we have enough trust that others are equally insignificant, then at least we can expect, I'm insignificant, you're insignificant, we shall not clash. The entirety of the problem we are addressing here is the necessary adaptation of humans to an environment with increased population density. I consider this to be the most crucial variable. Whenever there are many people in one place, the demands on an individual's mentality require significant changes. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar introduced in the 1990s the idea of Dunbar's number. This number describes the capacity for stable, close social relationships an individual can safely maintain. The origin of this number is found in the study of the correlation between the size of primate's brain and the average size of the group of respective species. When applying this technique to humans, the resulting number is around 150 relationships. In other words, a person can comfortably maintain about 150 people whom they truly know and do not consider strangers. Of course, this view is highly reductionist, as it is solely based on the average size of the brain. Much more important in this regard would be the density of neural connections. And despite that, we are missing a whole range of biological elements that would need to be considered in a holistic view. For example, the production and reactivity to oxytocin, a neurotransmitter responsible, among other things, for bonding. The point, however, remains. There is some, albeit challenging to find and trace, limiting number that strongly determines the size of cohesive community an individual can maintain. Any number that exceeds this boundary requires increased uncomfortable expenditure of energy and becomes a growing source of stress. Because we humans are not only beings of nature, biology, but primarily beings of culture, we supplement these biological limitations with cultural methods and abilities. While a chimpanzee troop can generate oxytocin necessary for its maintenance, essentially only through cuddling and picking each other's fleas, we humans have exceeded the biologically defined Dunbar's number with a whole range of specifically human inventions. Perhaps the most groundbreaking is the use of language and voice itself. When a whole group of human hunters and gatherers sits around a fire, they don't all have to cuddle. Much greater production of oxytocin and sense of unity can be achieved, for example, when everyone sings together. Those of you who enjoy singing with friends, perhaps in a pub with a guitar, know the powerful effect it has on a feeling of unity. And we apply a whole range of such tools to maintain our unity. Just the fact that we dress in a similar fashion, speak the same language, and try to maintain a common moral and ethical norms makes us capable of existing in numbers much larger than the originally biologically given Dunbar's number. One of the very important functional elements of religious tradition is precisely the generation of social cohesion. In this view, diversity is definitely not a strength. Any form of diversity is a rift that increases distrust, stress, and with it, the ultimate aggressiveness of all individuals involved. It doesn't matter whether we are talking about cultural, linguistic, racial, religious, or any other diversity. Any form of diversity is a form of social stressor. And yes, it is entirely clear that often the positives of such a diversity outweigh its negatives. This is a complex situation, and no slogan in the form of diversity is strength will ever be anything more than ideological outcry, one that awkwardly avoids the multidimensional, holistic situation of our complex universe. My point is that where there is diversity, there is need to somehow substitute for the disruption of social cohesion that it causes. Only under such conditions can diversity truly contribute. We can see this even in the division of human labor. Obviously, we need both a skilled craftsman and an educated engineer. However, their different backgrounds are definitely a source of tension, which society must somehow deal with. For example, Africa is linguistically, culturally, and religiously perhaps the most diverse place on the planet. And it is also a place of constant conflicts, stress, and political and ethnic turmoil. When we combine all these elements and place them in the context of the previously described urban biome, city mentality begins to make a new sense. Urban liberalism, leftism, herd mentality, and preference for central planning are simply caused by the fact that humanity, thrown into the urban jungle, must struggle hard to figure out how to prevent this structure from collapsing under its own weight and the stress it causes. As I have shown, in many ways, this megalopolitan mentality, city mentality, is what results in a leftist approach to politics. And look, I really do not like how we as a society work with the term left-wing and right-wing politics. World is not that simple, and these labels are changing all the time. I am from Europe, and specifically from a post-socialist country. For me, these terms and outlook on life are completely different than for an American. On one hand, I feel great generational trauma of the repression done in the name of socialism under the Soviet leadership. On the other hand, I think that public health care should be part of a civilized society. And yes, also the growing inequality is an issue that needs to be addressed. So pardon me for the imperfect use of the word leftist in the coming chapter. Problem of these labels is an incredible rabbit hole, and the political landscape is multidimensional. So let's try this. Instead of understanding the word leftist in the perspective you yourself have integrated, I implore you to try to entangle what I mean when I use this label. I know it's an imperfect situation, but alas, such is the nature of complex matters. So, that being said, an absolutely perfect and spot-on analysis of modern leftist mentality comes from the pen of the brilliant mathematician, anthropologist, and terrifying terrorist Ted Kaczynski, who in his manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, has the leftist mindset absolutely nailed down. I want to make it clear, I do not endorse his activities or the methods he used to fight for his ideas. Also, it is crucial to note that I do not agree with his ideology at all. Ted is an anarcho-primitivist, a radical who essentially proposes dismantling the system and climbing back on the trees. Ultimately, I consider this extreme reactionarism to be entirely misguided. But that doesn't change the fact that his analysis is absolutely spot on. Ted points out two main elements that shape modern leftist thinking, namely, the sense of inferiority and over-socialization. Now, Ted is obviously a pretty spiteful guy, so his analysis is pretty harsh and standoffish, but he's not wrong. The sense of inferiority is a powerful driving force behind the leftist movement. As mentioned earlier, one way to cope with urban life is to intensely integrate into a broader herd, becoming an unremarkable part of it. To be a member of the mass, one must be average and ordinary. Excelling in any area poses a threat to the individual and the cohesion of the entire group. This gives rise to herd mentality, which Nietzsche calls the morality of the weak. Now, the pitfall of this situation is that it tends to decay into a resentful amalgam of negative emotions. The reasonable question of material justice of our society is hijacked by envy. From the Latin word invideo, meaning to look back with malice. This is eventually, in many ways, what hides behind leftist redistribution efforts. It's not actually about everyone having the same, or at least those who have less to have more. It's solely about dismantling those who already have more. Envy would rather seek to destroy wealth than to let someone else have it. I don't want to sound heartless. Wealth inequality is an incredibly harsh problem that has plagued us for ages. However, the issue is that the left, thanks to the confused and misguided legacy of Marxism, misses the root of the problem itself. The problem of how our universe behaves mathematically. How distribution of anything really behaves mathematically. A problem shared by all societies, regardless of their political system. And there really isn't a political system capable of handling it. Eventually, the correction is always brutal, catastrophic, and absolutely out of our hands. The Black Plague comes into mind, or the turmoil and famine of the 17th century. But I digress. I'm just trying to convey that some strategies of urban life tend to evoke a very negative outlook on the world in the population, full of resentment and envy, which they then use to hinder social growth, just to soothe their own pains they don't want to or can't address directly. Here I do not come from the place of hate. My criticism may be harsh, but I empathize with the struggle of modern humanity. I simply wish for us to find a better way. The second driving force that Ted identified is over-socialization. It is, in essence, the domestication of humans to an absurd degree, a process that deliberately tries to make humans toothless, weak, and filled with a sense of guilt from the conflict between societal morality and natural feelings. As Ted writes, it's normal to hate someone. It's completely natural emotion. But the societal code tells us to be ashamed of it because it disrupts social cohesion. With this attempt for absolute acceptance of social norms taken to the extreme, one enters a vicious cycle. By ridding oneself of basic instinctive feelings, he then loses the ability to react adequately to social reality. But this causes social reality to deteriorate. And the over-socialized individual becomes increasingly filled with frustration over the conflict between reality and the ideas of ethical norms that were deeply ingrained in him. This frustration then turns into further self-hatred, a sense of guilt, and lowered self-esteem. Speaking of which, wokeism is the result of these cursed processes. The original practical problem of high-density population is set as follows. Diversity reduces social cohesion, and therefore ways must be found to substitute it so that we can continue to enjoy the reasonable benefits of diversity. The failure occurs when things are taken to extreme mishandled levels. This happened precisely with woke ideology. It made such a strange move, turning the originally studied problem, diversity, into an altar of its own. Suddenly the goal is not practically mitigating conflicts caused by diversity, it's not the analysis of the situation, and it's not the harmonization of society. On the contrary, the chosen concept, diversity, becomes the absolute reason for the entire ideological endeavor. Wokeism then tries to solve the subsequent extreme strain on social cohesion with a fanatical emphasis on purity of thoughts. And in doing so, it falls into an ever-growing spiral of even bigger resentment. The city is a weird kind of biome. It is a place where the individual is insignificant, and ideas are ingrained in them to make them weak and powerless. In a way, the city tries to impose upon the individual the role of a serf, a small medieval farmer, this time without their own plot of land, their own sky, and without hope for traditional community. The city is a place that surrounds one with inorganic enormity, a world of steel blocks, instilling the idea of what the new human universe is, and how the individual should fit into it. Small, cowering, and worshipping society. All of this just so that this entire Babylon can stand. For the frustrated and suffering individual, only superficial sins and dark intentions remain as an outlet. We can't do much with the concept of the city. The city will be here. But I believe that we can seek ways to make it bearable. And I believe that beneath the sediment of all the confusion of modern liberalism, somewhere hides a good heart with a good purpose, however misguided, however tainted by evil, it's still in its core good. We also cannot rid ourselves of the necessity of certain diminution of the individual. It's simply necessary for our species to exist. But we must find ways to do so nobly, and without the loss of dignity. If we lose our dignity, we lose faith in ourselves. This is precisely why the West is now committing ideological self-destruction. We must replace the feeling of inferiority with a true virtue, humility. Gothic cathedrals also evoke a sense of smallness in us. They elicit in us, however, a gracious feeling of reverence. They evoke in us magne mirare, the great awe. But this awe is not directed towards Babylon itself. This awe is not placed on the altar of faltering human society, stumbling from problem to problem. By worshipping society and the state, one loses hope for constructive criticism, and without it, there can be no real improvement. We as humans must learn to direct our sense of humility towards something that transcends us, towards the incredible size and monumentality of our own being, of our soul, of our consciousness. With this love for the light of life, we can maintain our large society and reap its benefits. For this society to exist, we must not sacrifice our own dignity, our own individuality, and our own faith. If we do so, we will fall like Babylon.